11:39 in the morning, June 19, 1944, 20,000 feet above the Philippine Sea, east of Guam. Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu, 25 years old, is flying an F6F Hellcat off the deck of the USS Lexington. He tips his wing and looks down. Below him, flying in a rigid textbook formation, are Japanese dive bombers. He counts them. He counts at least 40. In the next 8 minutes, Vraciu will shoot down 6 of those planes. He will use 360 rounds of ammunition, 60 rounds per kill. When he lands back on the Lexington, he will hold up 6 fingers for the camera. The photograph will become the face of what American pilots start calling, that same afternoon, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. But this story is not about those 6 planes. 400 miles to the west, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa is standing on the bridge of a brand new Japanese aircraft carrier called Taiho. He does not know his radio room is far less silent than his doctrine assumes, and that American listeners are hearing every check his pilots make. He believes silence means victory. Before the sun sets tomorrow, 315 of his 423 carrier aircraft will never come back. His flagship will explode. 2 more of his carriers will sink into the Philippine Sea. The answer is not that American planes were better. The answer is a system the Japanese Navy did not know existed. To understand why so many Japanese airmen died in a single afternoon over the Philippine Sea, you have to go back 4 days. Not 4 years. 4 days. On the morning of June 15, 1944, the first waves of United States Marines began wading ashore on the western beaches of Saipan. By nightfall, roughly 20,000 men would be on the island. The full invasion force numbered over 70,000. Saipan was not a random island in a random ocean. This often our southern anchor of the Mariana Chain, a group of volcanic and coral islands that sat in a straight line pointing directly at the Japanese home islands. From an airfield on Saipan, a new American bomber called the B-29 Superfortress could fly to Tokyo, drop a full bomb load, and fly back. From an airfield on Saipan, the industrial heart of the Japanese Empire came into range for the first time in the war. In Tokyo, this simple geographic fact was understood as an existential crisis. If Saipan fell, the Emperor's palace fell into the shadow of American bombers. If Saipan fell, the war stopped being something that happened on distant islands and started being something that happened over Yokohama, Osaka, Nagoya. Cities that had never seen a bomb before would burn. The Imperial General Staff understood this. The Naval Staff understood this. And Admiral Toyoda Soimyu, 59 years old, the newly appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet, understood this with absolute clarity. Toyoda had only held the top job for 6 weeks. His predecessor, Admiral Koga Minachi, had vanished in a storm over the Philippines in March, his flying boat lost with all hands. Toyoda inherited a fleet that was smaller, hungrier, and more desperate than the fleet his predecessor had commanded. But he also inherited a plan that had been drafted, redrafted, and war-gamed for months. A plan that promised on paper a decisive victory. A plan called AGO. Toyoda activated it on June 15th. Within hours of the first Marine landing on Saipan, coded orders were flashing out across the Pacific to a fleet anchored in the southern Philippines. The first mobile fleet, 9 aircraft carriers, 5 battleships including the 2 largest ever built, Yamato and Musashi, cruisers, destroyers, tankers, and on the flight decks, 423 carrier aircraft. The commander of that fleet was Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, 57 years old, 6 feet tall, which in the Imperial Japanese Navy made him unusually large. Quiet, reserved, considered by his American opponents to be, along with Yamamoto, the most dangerous carrier admiral Japan had produced. Ozawa was an experienced senior naval officer who had led major Japanese naval formations in the Indian Ocean and later commanded the Third Fleet. He had watched from a distance as Nagumo's carriers burned at Midway. And now, In June of 1944, the survival of the empire was placed in his hands. Ozawa boarded his new flagship at Tawi-Tawi anchorage in the southern Philippines. Her name was Taiho. She was 3 months old. 29,000 tons. The first Japanese aircraft carrier built with an armored flight deck. The Imperial Navy called her unsinkable. Ozawa stood on her bridge on the morning of June 16th as the mobile fleet weighed anchor and began the long steam north toward Saipan. His plan rested on 3 pillars. The first pillar was range. Japanese carrier aircraft had been designed from the beginning to prioritize distance over protection. The Mitsubishi A6M0, the Aichi D3A, and its successor, the Yokosuka D4Y Judy, the Nakajima B6N Jill torpedo bomber. All of them stripped of armor plating. All of them flying with fuel tanks that were not self-sealing. Every pound saved was a mile added. The result was that Japanese carrier aircraft could strike targets 300 miles away and return. American carrier aircraft, heavier and better protected, had a shorter reach. Ozawa's plan was to use this difference, like a fencing master uses a longer blade. He would position his carriers approximately 350 miles west of the American fleet. He would launch his planes from beyond the American strike radius. His pilots would hit the Americans, then land at Japanese-held airfields on Guam and Rota to refuel and rearm, then fly a second mission back to their carriers. The Americans, unable to reach him, would be pounded from a sanctuary they could not touch. The second pillar was Kakuta. Vice Admiral Kakuta Kakuji, 53 years old, commander of the 1st Air Fleet based on the Marianas Islands themselves. On paper, Kakuta commanded more than 500 land-based aircraft distributed across airfields on Guam, Tinian, Rota, and Saipan. Ozawa's plan called for these land-based aircraft to strike the Americans first, weakening them before the carrier strikes arrived. Kakuta's planes were also the safe harbor, where Ozawa's carrier pilots would land after their first mission. Without Kakuta, the shuttle bombing plan was impossible. Without Kakuta, the mobile fleet would have to recover its own aircraft over enormous distances, exhausting its air groups. Kakuta was not a supporting player. Kakuta was foundational. The third pillar was silence. Japanese naval doctrine had been forged in the early triumphant days of the war, when the Zero was the best carrier fighter in the world, and Japanese pilots outclassed everyone they met. In those days, radio discipline was a weapon. If your radio room was disciplined, the enemy could not triangulate your position. Ozawa's plan valued that discipline. Pilots were expected to keep chatter to a minimum, to hold their tongues on the run-in, to speak only when they had to. The reality was messier. Japanese air groups still made pre-flight radio checks. They still made in-flight checks. They still called flight leaders when formations drifted. Every one of those transmissions was a candle burning in the dark. And on the American side, hidden in a windowless compartment on a battleship, a radio intelligence team was watching for candles. Range, Kakuta, discipline, 3 pillars. Ozawa carried his plan onto the bridge of Taiho on the morning of June 16th, and by all appearances, all 3 pillars were solid. They were not. 2 of them were already dead. The third was leaking, 400 miles to the northeast, on the flag bridge of another aircraft carrier. Another admiral was preparing his own operation. His name was Mark Andrew Mitcher. He was 57 years old, the same age as Ozawa. He was not 6 feet tall. He was 5 feet 6, thin-hunched, weathered. He wore a long-billed baseball cap turned backward to keep the wind out of his face. He almost never smiled. He almost never raised his voice. His face looked like tanned leather that had been left out in the sun for a decade too long, because that was more or less what had happened to it. Mitcher had been one of the first American naval aviators awarded pilot wings in 1916. He had commanded USS Hornet during the Doolittle Raid in 1942. He had commanded the same ship at Midway. He had spent almost 30 years watching carrier aviation grow from a stunt into a doctrine, into a war-winning weapon. Now he commanded Task Force 58, the fast carrier force of the United States Pacific Fleet. 15 aircraft carriers, 7 fleet carriers, 6 of them the new Essex class and 1 USS Enterprise, the last survivor of the pre-war Yorktown class, 8 lighter Independence class carriers. On the flight decks, approximately 900 aircraft. Of those, roughly 475 were F6F Hellcat fighters. The Hellcat was the answer to the Zero. Not a better dogfighter at low speed, not more maneuverable, not lighter, heavier, armored, self-sealing fuel tanks, 650 caliber Browning machine guns in the wings that could saw a Japanese airframe in half in a 2-second burst. A 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine that could pull the Hellcat into a vertical climb and hold it there. The Hellcat could not turn with a Zero. It did not have to. It could climb faster, dive faster, and absorb hits that would have killed any Japanese fighter 3 times over. Grumman was building them at a factory in Bethpage, Long Island, at a rate that eventually reached 1 Hellcat every hour, 24 hours a day. By June of 1944, there were more Hellcats in the Pacific than Japan had trained carrier pilots left in the world. Mitchell did not command Task Force 58 alone. Above him, on a battleship called Indianapolis, stood Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance, 57 years old, the same age as Ozawa and Mitchell. Spruance was a quiet, precise, extraordinarily disciplined officer who had commanded the American carriers at Midway. He was famously careful. He was famously unemotional. He was, in the words of one of his own officers, the coldest fish in the fleet. And on June 19th, Spruance would make a decision that would cause American naval officers to argue with each other for the next 60 years. Spruance had a written directive from Admiral Nimitz. His primary mission was not to destroy the Japanese fleet. His primary mission was to protect the invasion of Saipan. The Marines on the beach were vulnerable. If Ozawa slipped past the American fleet and got in among the troop transports, the invasion could turn into a slaughter. Nimitz had made this priority explicit. Spruance internalized it. Whatever else happened, the beach at Saipan came first. This directive meant that Spruance could not do what Mitchell desperately wanted to do, which was race west, find Ozawa, and destroy him with a preemptive strike. Instead, Spruance kept Task Force 58 tethered to a defensive box west of Saipan. He would let Ozawa come to him. He would fight from a position of shield, not sword. Mitchell, on the flag bridge of the carrier Lexington, understood the order. He did not have to like it. He did not like it. While Ozawa was steaming north with 3 flawed pillars, and Spruance was preparing to defend a beach, the third element of the story was already collapsing. That element was the Japanese pilot. To understand what happened over the Philippine Sea on June 19th, you have to understand what had happened to the men in the cockpits before the battle even began. In December of 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy possessed the finest carrier aviators in the world. There were about 3,500 of them. They had been trained for years. Some had over 1,000 hours in the air. Many were combat veterans of the war in China. They flew the raid on Pearl Harbor. They sank Prince of Wales and Repulse. They savaged the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean. They fought the American carriers at Coral Sea and Midway. They fought them again at Eastern Solomons and Santa Cruz. And in every one of those battles, some of them died. The Japanese pilot training program had been designed for peacetime. It was slow, meticulous, obsessed with quality over quantity. When the war began, it could not scale. It could not replace losses at the rate the losses were happening. And in the year of 1943, in the grinding attritional air campaign over Rabaul and the Solomon Islands, the losses accelerated into a hemorrhage. Month after month, the veteran cadre bled away. The men who had trained for years were being replaced by men who had trained for months, then by men who had trained for weeks. By June of 1944, Many of the young Japanese aviators reporting aboard Ozawa's carriers had been given only a few months of operational training before assignment to a combat squadron. Some had 2 months, some had 6. On the American side, naval aviators generally reached the fleet after roughly 2 years in the training pipeline, with well over 300 hours in their logbooks before they saw an enemy aircraft, and many with considerably more. This was not a difference of degree. This was a difference of kind. It was the difference between a professional and an apprentice. The situation was made worse by the base, where Ozawa's fleet had spent the weeks before the battle. Tawi-Tawi, in the far southern Philippines, was chosen because it was close to the oil fields of Borneo, and the fleet was starving for fuel. The mobile fleet reached Tawi-Tawi in the middle of May, but Tawi-Tawi had no proper airfields ashore, and the waters around the anchorage were infested with American submarines. Every time a Japanese carrier tried to sortie into open water to conduct flight training, submarines were waiting. Several destroyers were torpedoed and sunk in the vicinity. By the end of May, Ozawa had made the judgment call that he could not risk his carriers for training flights. So the training stopped. For roughly the next 3 weeks, until the fleet departed in the middle of June, the young pilots of the mobile fleet sat on their anchored carriers in the tropical heat of Tawi-Tawi. They read manuals, they listened to lectures, they watched training films. Some of them had joined their squadrons directly from flight school and had never landed on a moving carrier at sea. They would learn how to do it in combat, or they would learn how to die trying. This was the force Ozawa was leading north. On the manifest, 423 carrier aircraft. In the cockpits, students. While Ozawa was steaming north, Micha was already at work. On June 11th, 4 days before the Marine landing, Task Force 58 launched a massive fighter sweep against the Marianas. 208 Hellcats hit airfields on Guam, Tinian, Rota, and Saipan. They caught Japanese aircraft on the ground, in revetments, being fueled, being armed. They shot down Japanese fighters that scrambled to intercept. On June 12th, they came back. On June 13th, they came back again. By the evening of June 13th, before Ozawa's fleet had even entered the Philippine Sea, the second pillar of the AGO plan had been badly cracked. Kakuta's 500 land-based aircraft, the strike force that was supposed to weaken the Americans before the carriers arrived, and the safe harbor where Ozawa's carrier pilots were supposed to land, had been reduced to a fraction of their intended strength. Historians still argue about how many Japanese aircraft were actually destroyed on the Marianas between June 11th and June 13th. The most conservative estimates put the number at around 100. Other estimates put it above 200. What is not in dispute is that Kakuta's air fleet, as an offensive weapon, had been effectively broken during those 3 days, even though some Japanese aircraft on Guam would still be able to operate on the morning of June 19th. And here is where a question arises that historians have never fully answered. What did Kakuta tell Tokyo? What did he tell Ozawa? The available evidence, drawn from post-war interrogations, surviving Japanese records, and the memoirs of officers who served on Ozawa's staff, indicates that Kakuta's reports to higher command during the middle of June were, at best, incomplete. At worst, they were misleading. Some accounts suggest that Kakuta's radio communications with his airfields were repeatedly disrupted by American attacks, so that he genuinely did not know how bad the situation was. Other accounts suggest something less charitable, that Kakuta understood the destruction perfectly well and shaded his reports to avoid the professional consequences of admitting the truth. Japanese naval culture in 1944 was not friendly to officers who delivered catastrophic news. Careers ended over less. Whatever Kakuta's motives were, and we may never know them with certainty, the effect was the same. Ozawa steamed north, believing that his second pillar was standing. It was not standing, it had been shattered. He would not learn this for another 6 days. While Ozawa was blind to the collapse of Kakuta's air fleet, the Americans were not blind to Ozawa. Somewhere in the depths of the Western Pacific, at 1835, on the evening of June 15th, the submarine USS Flying Fish sighted the Japanese mobile fleet coming out of the San Bernardino Strait between the Philippine Islands. Her captain, Commander Robert Risser, radioed the sighting to Pearl Harbor. 90 minutes later, another American submarine, USS Seahorse, spotted a second Japanese task group south of Mindanao. That report also went out. By dawn on June 16th, Admiral Spruance on Indianapolis knew that Ozawa was at sea and that he was coming. For the next 3 days, the two fleets converged on each other across 1,000 miles of empty ocean. American submarines shadowed the Japanese, providing periodic updates on course and speed. American search planes flew hundreds of miles west, looking for the enemy. Ozawa, confident in his range advantage and in the discipline of his pilots, did not know how much the Americans knew. On the American ships, preparations were meticulous. Ready rooms filled with pilots being briefed on the situation. Squadron commanders stood in front of chalkboards, drawing arrows on maps of the Philippine Sea. Ordnance crews on the hangar decks loaded ammunition belts and mounted 500-pound bombs, and in a series of small, dimly lit rooms buried deep inside the American carriers and battleships, another kind of preparation was underway. A kind of preparation that had never existed in any previous naval war. These rooms were called Combat Information Centers. CI. In each fleet carrier, the CIC was a windowless compartment about the size of a large living room, painted flat black to reduce reflections on the display screens. It was air-conditioned, because the electronic equipment inside generated enormous amounts of heat. It smelled of ozone from the vacuum tubes and cigarette smoke from the officers. At the center of the room was a plotting table, roughly the size of a pool table, covered in transparent plexiglass. Above the table hung red lights, chosen because red light preserves night vision. Around the walls were the radar repeaters. Vertical plotting boards where enlisted men wrote in reverse, using grease pencils, so that officers on the other side of the transparent surface could read the plots forward. The radar sets that fed these rooms were themselves a revolution. The SK Air Search radar, mounted on the mast of every American carrier, could detect a formation of incoming aircraft at ranges up to 75 miles. The SM radar could measure altitude with reasonable precision. The information from these sensors flowed into the CIC in real time. Enlisted radarmen called the ranges and bearings out loud. Other enlisted men transferred the information to the plotting boards with grease pencils. Officers stood over the plots, calculating vectors, speeds, and intercept geometries. And then those officers, called Fighter Direction Officers or FDOs, spoke into radio microphones connected to the Combat Air Patrol Hellcats, orbiting above the fleet. The FDO was the most important man in the room. His job was to look at a two-dimensional plot of dots moving on a plexiglass screen and translate that plot into instructions that a fighter pilot flying somewhere in the sky could act on. Steer to 270. Climb to Angels 20. Bogies 20 miles ahead of you, slightly above. The pilot did not have to see the enemy. The FDO could see for him. By the time the pilot's eyes finally picked up the enemy formation as tiny dots against the sky, the pilot was already positioned above and behind them, with the sun at his back, with the altitude advantage, with the geometry of a killer. The Imperial Japanese Navy was not without radar in 1944. Taiho and other major Japanese warships carried air search sets, including the Type 21 and the Type 13, capable of detecting incoming aircraft at meaningful ranges. What they did not have was what the Americans had built around those sets. The Japanese had no equivalent to the CIC. No permanent fighter direction officers at their radar consoles. No standardized procedures for translating radar returns into vectored intercepts. Japanese fighter direction, when it happened at all, tended to be improvised, done by senior pilots in the air working from visual observations, and shouted radio calls. The Japanese had the sensor. They had not built the nervous system. This is the point that has to be understood before June 19th can make any sense at all. What the Americans had built in Task Force 58 was not just a bigger fleet with better aircraft. What they had built was an integrated system in which detection, communication, decision, and action were joined together into a single mechanized process. The radar detected, the radio intelligence teams listened, the plotters plotted, the FDO decided, the Hellcat killed. Each element amplified the others, and the total was something Ozawa and his staff, sitting on Taiho 400 miles away, could not even imagine because they had no equivalent to compare it against. Ozawa's plan assumed a symmetrical battle. My planes fly farther than yours, therefore I strike first and safely. But the battle was not going to be symmetrical. It was going to be structural. On the evening of June 18th, the two fleets were within striking distance. Ozawa was approximately 380 miles west of Task Force 58. Mitscher, on Lexington, sent a message to Spruance on Indianapolis. He proposed that Task Force 58 turn west overnight and steam toward the Japanese. If they did, at dawn on June 19th, they could launch a massive strike against Ozawa's carriers from close range before Ozawa could launch his own strikes. Spruance thought about it. Then Spruance said no. His reasoning was straightforward. If Task Force 58 steamed west during the night, it would move away from Saipan. If Ozawa split his fleet, one part could slip past to the north or south, while the American carriers were chasing the other part. If that happened, the amphibious fleet at Saipan would be exposed. The Marines on the beach would be exposed. Nimitz's orders were explicit. The beach came first. Spruance ordered Task Force 58 to hold its position. Mitscher received the order. He did not argue. He was, in the naval hierarchy, a subordinate. He rolled up his charts. He walked to his ready room. He informed his air group commanders that Task Force 58 would fight the coming battle on the defensive. His pilots would not strike first. They would receive the enemy's strike and destroy it in the air. That decision, made on the evening of June 18th on a battleship named Indianapolis, was the last decision that mattered before the battle began. It set the geometry of everything that would happen the next day. It ensured that Ozawa would get to launch his aircraft into the sky under his own initiative, at the time and heading of his choosing, from a range he considered safe. It also ensured that when those aircraft came, they would fly directly into an electronic wall. At dawn on June 19th, aboard Taiho, Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship as the sky over the Philippine Sea began to lighten. He gave the order for search planes to launch first. Long-range Kate reconnaissance aircraft roared off his flight decks and disappeared into the eastern sky. Their job was to find the American fleet and report its exact position. Then, when the search planes reported contact, Ozawa would launch his strike waves. The first search reports came in around 7:30. The Americans were where Ozawa had expected them to be, approximately 350 miles east. He was outside their strike range. They could not touch him. His pilots could fly to them, hit them, and land on Guam to refuel. It was exactly the geometry his plan had called for. He ordered the first strike to launch. Carrier Division 3 began putting 69 aircraft into the air at around 8:00 on the morning of June 19th. 0 fighters flying escort, Judy dive bombers carrying bombs, Jill torpedo bombers carrying torpedoes. They climbed to altitude formed up over the fleet, and by roughly 8:45 the raid was on course, heading east toward Task Force 58. On the bridge of Taiho, Ozawa watched them go. Then he turned to give the orders to prepare the second wave, which would launch within the hour. He was, at that moment, a man executing a plan that he believed was working exactly as designed. He did not know that his second pillar had been shattered a week earlier, and that the airfields where his pilots were supposed to land were rubble. He did not know that the American submarines had been tracking him for 4 days, and that Spruance had known he was coming since the 16th. He did not know that American radio intelligence teams were listening to his pilots make routine transmissions and were passing warnings to the fighter direction officers. He did not know that the range he thought was protecting him was, at that very moment, being converted by American radar operators into a countdown timer. At 9:59, the SK air search radar aboard the battleship USS Alabama, 150 miles west of Task Force 58, detected the first Japanese strike wave. The plotters in the CIC began to draw lines with grease pencils on plexiglass. The fighter direction officers picked up their radio microphones, and on the flight decks of 15 American aircraft carriers, klaxons began to sound. The first blip appeared on the SK radar screen aboard USS Alabama at 9:59 in the morning. It was faint at first, a single glowing return sweeping in from the west at a range of 150 miles. Within seconds, more blips joined it, then more. Within a minute, the radar operator on Alabama was looking at a formation of at least 60 aircraft, flying in loose group, altitude estimated at 20,000 feet, bearing directly for Task Force 58. The report went out immediately on the Fleet Air Warning Circuit. In the combat information centers of every American carrier, from the Lexington to the Enterprise to the Yorktown, to the smaller Independence-class ships, plotting boards came alive. Enlisted men wrote coordinates in reverse behind plexiglass. Officers translated the plot into vectors, and on the flight decks, klaxons wailed, and deck crews began pulling chocks from the wheels of Hellcats that were already spinning up their engines. Mark Mitcher stood on the flagged bridge of Lexington and gave a single order. He ordered every strike aircraft on every American flight deck to launch and clear the sky. Dive bombers with bombs, torpedo bombers with torpedoes. He did not want them on his decks when the Japanese arrived. He wanted his decks empty and his flight deck crews ready to recover Hellcats that would need to refuel and rearm again and again through the day. He wanted a clean board. Within 30 minutes, more than 400 Hellcats were airborne. They climbed to 25,000 feet, orbited over the fleet in loose combat air patrol stations, and waited for their vectors. Below them, the American strike aircraft flew east to a safe holding area, orbiting harmlessly out of the way, unable to help, but at least not in the way. The first Japanese strike wave, 69 aircraft, was still 90 miles from Task Force 58 when the interception order went out. Fighter direction officers in 8 different combat information centers began speaking into their microphones. Steer 270. Climb to Angels 23. Bogies at your 12 o'clock, closing. Among the first Hellcat squadrons to make visual contact was VF-15 off USS Essex, led into the intercept by its squadron commander, Lieutenant Commander Charles Brewer. Brewer had been in the fleet for months and had never shot down an enemy aircraft in his life. That was about to change. Brewer rolled his Hellcat into a diving turn and led his division down through a scattered cloud layer. Below him, at approximately 20,000 feet, he saw them. Japanese dive bombers in a rigid formation, escorted by a smaller number of Zero fighters. They were flying straight and level, holding their heading, disciplined to the letter of the plan. They had no idea Brewer was above them until the first Hellcats opened fire. The first Japanese pilots to die that day never saw the men who killed them. They flew into a rain of half-inch bullets from above and behind. Judies exploded in midair, their fuel tanks igniting on the first hit. Zeros peeled away, trying to climb into the fight, but the Hellcats had the altitude advantage and would not give it back. A slashing pass, a burning Japanese plane spinning toward the ocean. Reset, another pass, another kill. Brewer alone shot down 4 Judies in the first strike wave. The other pilots of the F-15 shot down at least a dozen more. Some of the first wave got through. Perhaps 20 aircraft, battered and disorganized, pushed past the fighter screen and continued east toward the American ships. They flew directly into the second layer of the American defense. The layer they hit was the anti-aircraft fire of Task Force 58. Every American ship in the formation, from destroyers to cruisers to battleships to the carriers themselves, opened up, and the shells they were firing were not ordinary shells. The 5-inch guns of the fast battleships and heavy cruisers were firing rounds tipped with a device called the VT proximity fuse. The proximity fuse was one of the most closely guarded American secrets of the war. It had been developed by American, British, and Canadian scientists working in a laboratory in Silver Spring, Maryland. Inside the nose of each 5-inch shell, packed into a space smaller than a fist, was a tiny radio transmitter and receiver. When the shell was fired, the transmitter broadcast a continuous radio signal. When that signal bounced off the metallic mass of an aircraft and returned to the shell, the fuse detonated the shell automatically. The proximity fuse did not aim the gun. American gunners still needed a fire control solution. They still needed to calculate lead. They still needed to put the shell close to the target. What the fuse changed was the last variable in the equation. In previous years, a gunner had to guess how long to set the shell to burn before detonation, and if he guessed wrong by even a fraction of a second, the shell exploded harmlessly in empty air. The proximity fuse eliminated that guess. Get the shell close, and the shell would decide when to burst. The result, when it was combined with radar direction and analog fire control computers, was an anti-aircraft system whose lethality had jumped by an order of magnitude in a single generation. For Japanese pilots trying to press through anti-aircraft fire, the effect was catastrophic and unexplainable. They saw the sky filling with black bursts. They tried to jink, to weave, to change altitude, to throw off the American gunners. It made less difference than it should have. Shells that were fired close enough detonated near them anyway. Aircraft that had survived the Hellcat pass were shredded by fragmentation. Wings tore off, engines caught fire. Pilots who had trained for months to attack American ships never got within a mile of them. Behind the 5-inch guns were the 40mm Bofors quadruple mounts, aimed by Mark 51 optical sight directors that fed target data to the gun through simple analog computers. The Bofors fired at a combined rate of nearly 500 rounds per minute per mount. The tracer streams looked like solid red hoses of light. Behind the Bofors were the 20mm Oerlikon cannons, hand-aimed, close-in, throwing up a final wall of steel for anything that got within 1,000 yards. Of the 69 aircraft that Ozawa had launched in the first strike wave, approximately 41 did not come back. That was the first hour of the battle. At 8:10 that same morning, before the first Japanese strike wave had even reached the American radar screens, a completely separate action was unfolding beneath the surface of the Philippine Sea. Approximately 140 feet below the waves, the American submarine USS Albacore was maneuvering into an attack position. Her captain was Commander James Blanchard. Through his periscope, Blanchard was looking at something no American submarine commander had ever seen at close range before. An intact Japanese fleet carrier task group at sea, escorts spread wide, carriers steaming into the wind to launch aircraft. Blanchard picked the largest target he could see and lined up his shot. The target he picked was Taiho. Blanchard fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. The Albacore's fire control computer had suffered a malfunction moments before firing, forcing him to shoot by manual estimation. Aboard Taiho, at 8:16, according to Japanese accounts, a warrant officer pilot named Sakio Komatsu had just launched with the first strike wave when he spotted a torpedo wake running toward the flagship. He knew immediately what it meant. He turned his aircraft into a dive and flew it directly into the torpedo. The torpedo exploded. Komatsu was killed instantly. His sacrifice destroyed one of the 6 weapons Blanchard had fired. Of the 5 remaining torpedoes, 4 missed. 1 ran true. It struck Taiho on the starboard side, forward, in the area of the aviation gasoline storage tanks. The explosion was not spectacular by the standards of naval combat. It ruptured 2 of the ship's aviation fuel tanks. It damaged the forward elevator, which jammed in the down position. Taiho took a slight list. Her speed dropped briefly. Within minutes, she was back at 26 knots and continuing to launch aircraft. On the bridge of Taiho, Ozawa was informed of the torpedo hit. He acknowledged it. He did not consider it a serious matter. Taiho was armored. Taiho had watertight compartments. Taiho was designed to absorb hits that would have crippled older carriers. Ozawa continued the operation. Ozawa's main second raid, 128 aircraft launched by Carrier Division 1 centered on Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, began going into the air at about 9:00. Ozawa turned his attention east, toward the American fleet, toward the battle he believed was going in his favor. Below the waterline of his flagship, in the ruptured fuel tanks, invisible clouds of aviation gasoline vapor were beginning to spread. The second strike wave was the hammer blow. 128 aircraft, the largest single formation Ozawa would launch that day. Zeros, Judys, Jills. On paper, it was a war-winning force. In practice, it was more than 100 inexperienced pilots trying to hold formation across 300 miles of open ocean. The formation began to fracture almost immediately. Green pilots, unable to follow the muscle memory of veteran flight leaders because there were not enough veterans left to lead them, drifted apart in the varying wind layers over the Pacific. Navigators miscalculated their drift. Small clusters of aircraft became smaller clusters. By the time the second wave reached the outer air search radar picket of the American fleet, it was no longer a single hammer blow. It was a series of staggered fragments arriving on different vectors at different altitudes. The Americans destroyed them one fragment at a time. The first radar detection of the second wave came at 11:07. Fighter direction officers in the American CICs had time to prepare. They had already recovered some of the Hellcats that had killed the first wave, refueled them, rearmed them, and launched them back into the air. Fresh Hellcats waited at altitude for the second wave. When the vectors came, they came with mathematical precision. Steer 300. Climb. Bogey at 20 miles. At 11:39, 20,000 feet above the ocean, approximately 55 miles west of Task Force 58. Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu of VF-16 rolled his Hellcat into a diving pass on a formation of Japanese Judy dive bombers. Vraciu was 25 years old. Born in East Chicago, Indiana, the son of Romanian immigrants, he had already shot down 12 enemy aircraft before this morning. He had been complaining before takeoff that his engine was running rough and his supercharger was underperforming. He did not think he had a good aircraft that day. He did not need a good aircraft. Vraciu opened fire on the first Judy at close range. It exploded. He shifted to the next Judy. That one exploded. He shifted again. Third kill. Fourth, fifth. He was pulling deflection shots at close range, closing in behind each Judy and firing short bursts from his 6.50 caliber wing guns. Each burst was 2 or 3 seconds long. Each burst put approximately 60 rounds into a Japanese aircraft that had no armor plating and no self-sealing fuel tanks. Each Judy went down. The 6th Judy Vraciu shot down that morning was killed at such close range that debris from the explosion peppered his own Hellcat. He pulled up. He looked around. The sky, which had been full of Japanese aircraft 8 minutes earlier, was now full of falling smoke trails and empty air. Vraciu had fired approximately 360 rounds. He had shot down 6 Japanese dive bombers in 8 minutes. When he landed on Lexington later that morning, he taxied to his parking spot, cut the engine, climbed down from the cockpit, and held up 6 fingers. A photographer from the ship's photo lab took the picture. It is one of the most reproduced images of the Pacific War. Vraciu was not alone in his squadron. Across Task Force 58 that afternoon, other pilots were doing what he was doing. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, 34 years old, commander of Air Group 15 aboard Essex, flying a Hellcat he had named Mincy, led his own division into the second strike wave and shot down 5 Judies of his own. Later in the day, he added 2 Zeros. His total for June 19th would be 7 confirmed kills. It was the highest single-day score by any American naval aviator of the war up to that point. He would raise that number 4 months later at Leyte Gulf. That is a story for another time. Of the 128 aircraft in the second strike wave, the great majority did not come back. Some were shot down by Hellcats. Some were killed by 5-inch shells with proximity fuses. A few reached the American carriers and released their bombs, scoring 1 hit on the battleship South Dakota that killed 27 American sailors and wounded 23 more. It was the only significant hit any Japanese aircraft would score against the American fleet that day. On the bridge of Taiho, Ozawa did not know any of this. He was operating in the world his own doctrine had built. Radio silence, so far as he understood it, was being maintained. His first strike wave had gone essentially silent because his first strike wave was in combat. His second strike wave had gone essentially silent for the same reason. When the third wave launched 10 047 aircraft from Carrier Division 2, they too kept their transmissions to a minimum. When the fourth wave launched shortly after 11 082 aircraft, they did the same. 4 major carrier raids were launched between roughly 8:00 and 11:30 on the morning of June 19th. In total, Ozawa's 9 carriers put about 326 aircraft into the air across those 4 raids, while retaining additional aircraft for scouting and fleet defense. And on the flagship, the reports coming back from the strike leaders were sparse and confusing. Ozawa's staff understood the sparse traffic the way their doctrine had taught them to understand it. Sparse traffic meant the pilots were pressing home the attack. Sparse traffic meant success. Somewhere across the horizon, hundreds of aircraft were pressing home strikes against an American fleet that, according to plan, could not have seen them coming. The plan was wrong. The American fleet had seen them from 150 miles out, and the sparse traffic was not the sound of success. It was the sound of dying. The third strike wave, 47 aircraft, was launched based on Ozawa's confidence that the first 2 waves were succeeding and that a follow-up strike would exploit the damage. The wave headed east along the search line the earlier waves had used. Almost none of them found the American fleet. The search coordinates had been reported inaccurately by an earlier scout plane. The formation flew across empty water for hours, burning fuel, seeing nothing. A handful stumbled into the outer American combat air patrol and were shot down. The rest turned back and landed on their carriers. Of the 47 aircraft in the third wave, only about 7 were lost. It was the least catastrophic of Ozawa's 4 attacks, but only because it accomplished nothing. The fourth wave was different. 82 aircraft, launched shortly after 11:00, split into 2 groups because different squadrons received different sets of coordinates for the American fleet. The larger group flew to a set of coordinates that turned out to be empty water. Frustrated, low on fuel, unable to find the enemy, the commanders of that group made the decision to divert Guam and Rota to refuel at the airfields Kakuta was supposed to be holding. The airfields were not being held in the sense the plan had assumed. Some Japanese aircraft on Guam were still operational, but at the runways were pockmarked with craters, ground crews were scattered, and American aircraft owned the air overhead. The Americans had been tracking the fourth wave on radar. The fighter direction officers on the American ships watched the plot turn south, then east, and immediately understood that the Japanese were heading for Orote Field on Guam. Hellcat squadrons that had already recovered, refueled and rearmed were vectored to Guam. When the exhausted Japanese pilots of the fourth wave descended toward a rote field, landing gear down, flaps down, throttles pulled back to landing power, they entered the traffic pattern above the runway they believed would save them. American Hellcats fell on them out of the clouds. The slaughter over Guam was the most one-sided engagement of the entire day. Japanese pilots were shot down on final approach. They were shot down turning downwind. They were shot down trying to firewall their throttles and climb away. Their aircraft were configured for landing. They could not maneuver. They could not accelerate. Some of them made it to the runway and were bounced by strafing Hellcats before they could climb out of their cockpits. Some were killed sitting on the taxiway waiting for fuel. Of the 82 aircraft in the fourth wave, approximately 73 did not survive the day. By the end of June 19th, above the Philippine Sea and Guam and the airfields of the Marianas, Japanese carrier and land-based aviation had suffered catastrophic losses. American losses for the day were far smaller. Somewhere in the middle of the fighting, over the radio circuit of Task Force 58, an unnamed American pilot said the sentence that would give the battle its popular name. He said it sounded like an old-time turkey shoot back home. The words spread through the fleet. By evening, everyone was calling it that. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. It was a phrase that suggested luck, ease, sport. In fact, it was the opposite. What was happening in the sky over the Philippine Sea on June 19th was not a turkey shoot. It was the industrialized end result of a decade of American investment in radar, in fire control computers, in proximity fuses, in fighter direction doctrine, in radio intelligence, in Hellcat production, in pilot training programs at Pensacola and Corpus Christi that pushed young men through more than 300 hours of flight time and roughly 2 years in the pipeline before they saw combat. The turkey shoot was not a stroke of good fortune. The turkey shoot was the payoff on billions of dollars and years of methodical, disciplined work by tens of thousands of Americans who never saw combat and never received medals. None of that showed up in the phrase. The phrase suggested the Japanese were just easy targets. The truth was that the Japanese were flying into a system. While the turkey shoot was consuming the Japanese air groups over the ocean, another disaster was unfolding aboard Ozawa's flagship Taiho. The single torpedo that USS Albacore had put into Taiho's starboard side at 8:16 had ruptured 2 of the ship's aviation gasoline storage tanks. The immediate structural damage was contained. Taiho was still steaming. Taiho was still launching and recovering aircraft. But inside the ship, invisible and deadly, aviation gasoline vapor was rising from the ruptured tanks and beginning to spread through the enclosed spaces of the lower decks. The Japanese Navy in 1944 had not yet developed the damage control doctrine that would become standard in later fleets. The officer in charge of damage control on Taiho was not one of the experienced men who had spent years learning how to handle fuel emergencies on carriers. He was a younger officer whose name has not survived in the surviving records. He faced a problem he had never trained for. His ship was filling with invisible explosive vapor. He needed to get the vapor out. He made a decision. He ordered the ship's ventilation system open to maximum. He ordered all fans running. He ordered the ducts to the lower decks fully open. His reasoning was that increased ventilation would dilute the gasoline vapor and vent it overboard. What actually happened was that the ventilation system distributed the aviation gasoline vapor evenly throughout the ship. The vapor rose from the ruptured tanks. It flowed through the ducts. It filled the hangar deck. It filled the crew spaces. It filled the machinery spaces. By the middle of the morning, Taiho was not a ship with a localized fuel leak in a forward compartment. Taiho was a ship saturated with an evenly distributed cloud of aerosolized aviation gasoline throughout her interior. She was a bomb the size of an aircraft carrier waiting for an ignition source. The ignition source came at approximately 14:32 in the afternoon. No one knows exactly what triggered it. It may have been a spark from electrical equipment. It may have been a small fire in a machinery space. Whatever the source, when the vapor ignited, the entire ship exploded from the inside. The armored flight deck, designed to protect Tai-ho from bombs falling from above, blew upward in a single sheet. The hull ruptured along multiple points. Fires erupted throughout the ship simultaneously. Bulkheads collapsed. Compartments flooded. Men who had been standing at their stations moments before were killed in the initial blast. Others were trapped below decks by fires and flooding. Ozawa was on the bridge. He survived the initial explosion, along with most of his senior staff. He immediately understood two things. First, Tai-ho was going to sink. Second, he needed to transfer his command to another ship if he was going to continue the battle. But naval tradition demanded that a commander not abandon a ship until it was clear the ship was lost. Ozawa initially refused to leave. His staff argued with him. Emperor's portrait had to be saved. Command continuity had to be preserved. The battle was not over. Eventually, Ozawa was persuaded. He and his senior officers slid down ropes from the burning flagship onto a destroyer that had come alongside. He would transfer his flag to the heavy cruiser Haguro. Later that evening, he would move again to the carrier Zuikaku. But for several hours in the middle of the afternoon on June 19th, at the exact moment his air groups were being annihilated over the American fleet, the commander of the Japanese mobile fleet was a man clinging to a rope ladder over the side of a burning ship. Tai-ho sank later that afternoon on June 19th. The exact death toll has been disputed among sources ever since. Older accounts often cite roughly 1,600 dead. More recent United States naval historical assessments suggest the figure was closer to 656 killed, with more than 1,000 of her crew surviving. What is not in dispute is that Ozawa's brand-new flagship, 3 months old, the ship the Imperial Navy had called unsinkable, was destroyed by a chain of events that began with a single American torpedo and ended with a damage control decision that spread aviation fuel vapor through the entire hull. The metaphor was total. Everything the Japanese Navy had lost in the previous 2 years, they were losing again in a single day. Not just because their equipment was inferior, because their systems were inferior, because their training pipeline had collapsed, because their institutional knowledge had been drowned in the reef at Midway and burned to ash over Guadalcanal. The men who had known what to do were dead. The men who had replaced them did not know what to do. Tai-ho was sunk by a submarine torpedo that ruptured her aviation fuel system, and by the damage control failures that let gasoline vapor spread through the ship until it ignited catastrophically. The equipment and the systems failed together. Neither one alone would have destroyed her, and she was not the last carrier to sink that day. 3 hours after USS Albacore had put its single torpedo into Tai-ho, a second American submarine was closing in on the mobile fleet from another angle. Her name was USS Kavala. Her commander was Herman Kostler on his boat's first war patrol. Kavala had been shadowing the Japanese fleet for 3 days. She had passed up an earlier opportunity to shoot at a destroyer because Kostler wanted a bigger target. At 11:22 on the morning of June 19th, Kostler got his bigger target. Through the periscope of Kavala, he lined up on a fleet aircraft carrier steaming into the wind, recovering aircraft. He fired a spread of 6 torpedoes. 3 of them hit. The target was Shokaku. Shokaku was one of the most storied aircraft carriers in the Imperial Japanese Navy. She had been laid down before the war. She had launched aircraft against Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. She had raided Ceylon. She had fought at the Battle of the Coral Sea and helped sink USS Lexington. She had fought at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons and helped sink USS Hornet at Santa Cruz. She had survived crippling damage on multiple occasions and returned to service each time. She was, by 1944, one of the last remaining links to the veteran cadre of Japanese carrier aviation. Cavala's torpedoes hit her while she was recovering aircraft. The bombers she was landing had fuel in their tanks and ordnance on their racks. The torpedoes ruptured Shokaku's own aviation gasoline storage. The explosions ignited the fuel from the recovering aircraft. Within seconds, the entire hangar deck was on fire. Bombs still mounted on aircraft began cooking off. Ammunition lockers detonated. Shokaku burned from the inside, and there was nothing her crew could do to save her. Shokaku sank at approximately 1 in the afternoon. She took more than 1,200 of her crew with her. Her flag captain was among the dead. In the space of 6 hours, the Imperial Japanese Navy lost 2 fleet aircraft carriers, one to a torpedo that triggered a chain reaction of aviation fuel and damage control failure, 1 to 3 torpedoes that ignited fires nothing could contain. Ozawa had begun the day with 9 flight decks. By dinner time, he had 7. He had also lost most of the carrier aircraft he had committed to the day's raids, and he did not yet fully know it. That was the situation as the sun began to set over the Philippine Sea on the evening of June 19, 1944. On his new flagship, Ozawa was still receiving fragmentary reports. He believed, at the end of the day, that his air groups had inflicted serious damage on the American fleet. He believed that many of his pilots had made it to Guam and would return the next day. He believed that his mobile fleet, though wounded, still had teeth. He was wrong about all 3 things, but he would not know he was wrong for another 24 hours. And when he did learn it, on the afternoon of June 20th, the last chapter of the disaster was still ahead of him. Ozawa woke on the morning of June 20th aboard Zuikaku, the carrier where he had transferred his flag the night before. Zuikaku was a sister ship of the Shokaku that had gone down the previous afternoon. She had been at Pearl Harbor. She had fought at Coral Sea. She was one of the last first-line fleet carriers the Imperial Navy still had, and now she was Ozawa's flagship. The reports coming in that morning were fragmentary, and in most cases wrong. Ozawa's staff was assembling numbers, based what pilots on Guam had radioed back the previous evening, on what returning stragglers had said as they landed, on what individual squadron commanders had reported. The numbers said that Ozawa had lost roughly 100 aircraft. The numbers said that many of his pilots had landed successfully at Guam and Rota and would fly back to the carriers as soon as the aircraft could be refueled. The numbers were fantasy. The airfields at Guam and Rota were craters and wreckage. The pilots who had tried to land there had been shot down over the runways. But nobody on Ozawa's staff wanted to be the one to tell him that. So the numbers stayed on the paper, and Ozawa continued to plan for a second day of battle. He turned the mobile fleet north and began steaming to a rendezvous point where he intended to meet an oiler group, refuel his surviving ships, and prepare to resume the offensive on the 21st. From his perspective, standing on the bridge of Zuikaku that morning, the situation was serious, but not catastrophic. He had lost Taiho and Shokaku. He had lost aircraft, but he still had 7 flight decks. He still had fuel. He still had, in his understanding of the situation, hundreds of pilots waiting to be recovered from the Marianas. 400 miles to the east, Mitchell was hunting him. American search aircraft had been in the air since dawn on June 20th, flying to the limit of their range in every direction, looking for the Japanese fleet. Hour after hour, they found nothing. The Philippine Sea is roughly the size of the state of Alaska. The Japanese fleet had a full night's head start. It was moving away. The contact report finally came at 15:40 in the afternoon. A search plane from USS Enterprise, flown by Lieutenant Robert Nelson, spotted the Japanese fleet at a range of approximately 275 miles west-northwest of Task Force 58. The transmission had trouble getting through. It took nearly an hour before Mitchell on Lexington had a confirmed position. By the time he had it, the tactical situation was terrible. 275 miles was at the extreme edge of the strike range of American carrier aircraft. Even the Hellcat, with an external drop tank, could barely make the flight and return. The dive bombers and torpedo bombers, heavier and thirstier, would be flying to the outer edge of what was physically possible. The sun would be setting within a few hours. Any strike launched now would return in darkness. Some of the aircraft would not have the fuel to return at all. Mitchell stood on his flag bridge on Lexington and made the decision alone. He signaled threats. He informed his air group commanders. He gave the order to launch. Between 1624 and 1643, 226 American carrier aircraft roared off the flight decks of Task Force 58 and turned west into a lowering sun. Hellcats, Helldivers, Avengers. Their pilots knew what they had been ordered to do. Some of them had done the math on their kneeboards during the taxi to the catapult. Some of them had said their goodbyes on the radio. They flew west anyway. They found the Japanese fleet at approximately 1840. The sun was already at the horizon. The pilots had perhaps 20 minutes of usable light. They pushed over into their attack runs and did what they could do in the time they had. They sank the carrier Hyo. Torpedoes from below Wood's Avenger squadron hit her in the engine room. Fires spread to her aviation gasoline. She burned for hours and went down that night. They damaged Zuikaku with bombs, though she remained afloat. They damaged the light carrier Chiyoda. They sank two of the fleet oilers Ozawa had been steaming to meet. They shot down some Japanese aircraft that rose to intercept them, though the surviving Japanese air groups were now so thin that the interception was ineffective. The strike broke off at last light. 226 aircraft turned east and began the long flight home. The sun was gone. The Philippine Sea was black. Below them was nothing but water for 250 miles. The first American pilots began to run out of fuel about halfway back to Task Force 58. Engines coughed, sputtered, and died. Aircraft glided down into the darkness and ditched into the ocean. Some pilots got out of their cockpits and inflated their life rafts. Some did not. The ones who did floated in the swells with their emergency lights blinking and waited for the sound of ship engines in the dark. At approximately 20:45, Mark Mitchell gave the order that would define him for the rest of his life. He was standing on the flag bridge of Lexington. He knew, from the volume of fuel exhaustion calls coming in over the radio, that mass pilots were going down all across the Western Pacific. He knew that many of them would not survive the night. He knew that Japanese submarines had been reported in the area. He knew what naval doctrine required. Doctrine required strict light discipline at night in a combat zone. Doctrine required silhouettes to be minimized. Doctrine required a fleet at night to become as invisible as possible. Mitchell gave the order to turn on the lights. Every ship in Task Force 58 lit up. Flight deck landing lights on the carriers. Truck lights on the mast tops. Signal lights. Searchlights pointed straight up into the sky as beacons. Star shells fired by destroyers, hanging on their parachutes, casting an artificial daylight over the ocean below. 15 aircraft carriers, 7 fast battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all lit up in the middle of the night, in the middle of a combat zone, deliberately making themselves the most visible thing in the Western Pacific. Aircraft above began to see the lights. Pilots, who had been resigning themselves to death in the water, turned toward the glow. Some of them landed on the correct carrier. Many of them landed on whichever carrier they could find. There were mid-air collisions in the landing pattern. There were crash landings on decks. There were aircraft that touched down on the water alongside destroyers and were plucked out by rescue crews within minutes. By dawn on June 21st, Task Force 58 had recovered most of the pilots who had ditched. Of the 226 aircraft that had launched the evening before, approximately 80 had been lost, most to fuel exhaustion, but the pilots, in most cases, had been saved. The exact figure has been debated ever since. What is not debated is that Mitch's decision to turn on the lights saved dozens of American lives that would otherwise have been lost to the sea. The order was a violation of every principle of night defense in the Fleet Handbook. Nobody in the Navy ever criticized him for it. Somewhere on the other side of the Philippine Sea, on the bridge of Zuikaku, Ozawa was finally beginning to understand what had happened to his air groups. Reports were catching up to reality. He had lost most of the aircraft he had committed to the raids of the 19th. Not every lost aircraft meant a dead pilot. Some had ditched near friendly ships. Some had been recovered. But the great majority of the men he had launched at dawn were gone, and the aircraft they had flown were gone with them. The airfields at Guam and Rota were not sheltering hundreds of his men. The airfields were rubble. Ozawa's mobile fleet, on paper still a powerful force with 7 aircraft carriers and battleships including Yamato and Musashi, had ceased to exist as a carrier aviation force. The ships were still there. The planes and the pilots to fly them were not. Ozawa told his staff that he intended to submit his resignation. He was, by his own assessment, responsible for the destruction of the Imperial Navy's last effective carrier air arm. He believed his professional life had to end with an acknowledgement of that fact. The message went to Admiral Toyoda at Combined Fleet Headquarters. Toyoda refused the resignation. The reasoning was practical. There were no other flag officers with Ozawa's carrier experience left. If Ozawa resigned, there was no one to replace him. The Imperial Navy was going to need him again. Toyoda ordered him to remain in command. Ozawa complied. He did not know that the next time the Imperial Navy needed him, 4 months later, his role would not be to fight a carrier battle. It would be to serve as bait. The controversy over what happened on June 19th started before the sun set on the 20th. It has not stopped since. The center of the argument is Raymond Spruance. Spruance had refused, on the evening of June 18th, to let Mitch steam west overnight and attack Ozawa at dawn. Spruance had held Task Force 58 defensively tethered to Saipan. Spruance had let Ozawa keep the initiative. Spruance had won a defensive victory that destroyed the Japanese carrier air arm, but had failed to destroy the Japanese carrier ships. Ozawa had gotten away with his flight decks. Some of them, at least. Mitch's own after-action report was carefully worded, but unmistakable in its implication. A more aggressive posture on the 18th might have caught Ozawa's fleet earlier and destroyed more of it. Other American flag officers were less careful in their language. Admiral William Halsey, who commanded the alternate command team that rotated in and out of the same task force, made it clear in private conversations that he would have handled the battle differently. He would get his chance 4 months later. His chance would produce its own controversies. But that is another story. Spruance's defenders pointed out that Nimitz's orders had been explicit. The primary mission was to protect the invasion of Saipan. Spruance had done exactly what he had been ordered to do. Saipan fell to the Marines on July 9th, 3 weeks after the naval battle ended. The B-29 airfields that were the entire strategic point of the invasion began operating within months. From those airfields, the strategic bombing campaign that eventually destroyed 67 Japanese cities began. The mission Nimitz had assigned to Spruance had succeeded. Whether that success was enough is a question the American Navy would argue about for decades. Spruance himself never publicly criticized his own decision. He also never publicly defended it. He simply moved on to the next command and the next one after that, and lived quietly after the war in Pebble Beach, California, until his death in 1969. The argument about what he should have done outlived him. 4 months after the Philippine Sea, in October of 1944, the Imperial Navy assembled its remaining strength for one final attempt to break the American offensive. The target this time was the American invasion of Leyte in the central Philippines. The plan, called Shugo, was even more desperate than Ago had been. Ozawa was assigned a role in Shogo that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. His job was to sail from the Japanese home islands with the 4 aircraft carriers he had left: Zukaku, Zuiho, and Chiyoda. Their flight decks were nominally functional. Their air groups were small, weak skeleton crews of poorly trained pilots, a fraction of what those decks had been designed to carry. The whole point of Ozawa's force was not to fight the American fleet. The whole point was to be seen by the American fleet. Ozawa's carriers were bait. Their job was to appear in the ocean north of the Philippines and to lure the American Third Fleet, commanded that month by Halsey, away from the actual battle zone off Leyte. If Halsey took the bait and steamed north to chase what looked like a carrier attack, the beaches at Leyte would be uncovered. The Japanese surface fleet, coming through the Philippine Sea from the west, could then break through and destroy the American invasion force. Halsey took the bait. On October 25, 1944, off Cape Engano, north of the Philippines, American aircraft from Halsey's fleet found Ozawa's decoy force. They attacked all day. They sank all 4 of the aircraft carriers Ozawa had brought north. Zuikaku, the last survivor of the carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor, went down that afternoon. Zuiho followed. Chitose and Chiyoda followed. Ozawa lost every flight deck he had left. The Japanese ruse worked. Halsey chased the bait, and the Japanese surface fleet did break through. But the American escort carriers off Samar fought a desperate defensive action that stopped the breakthrough, and the Leyte invasion survived. The Japanese sacrifice bought them nothing. Ozawa had spent his last carriers to enable a plan that failed. But the deeper truth of Leyte Gulf was the truth of the Philippine Sea, extended in time. Ozawa's carriers at Cape Engano were bait not because he wanted them to be bait. They were bait because that was the only useful thing they could still be. 4 months after June 19th, they had only a small and badly weakened air component compared with what those decks had been designed to carry. There was no more aviation fuel to train new pilots. There were no more experienced instructors to teach them. The ships were nearly empty flight decks, and a nearly empty flight deck cannot fight a conventional carrier battle. It can only trick someone into looking at it. The men who had died in the Turkey Shoot had not just died as individuals, they had died as an institution. They had been the last operational generation of Japanese naval aviation. When they went down over Guam and over Task Force 58, they took the aviation capability of the Imperial Navy with them. Everything after June 19th was cleanup. Spruance had been criticized for letting Ozawa escape with his carriers. The criticism assumed that ships were what mattered. Spruance himself, after the war, never claimed to have understood at the time what would later become obvious. But the historical record shows what he actually accomplished. He did not sink Ozawa's carriers. He killed Ozawa's ability to use them. And 4 months later, that killing turned out to be more decisive than any amount of sunk tonnage would have been. The carriers Spruance let escape sailed to Leyte with only a handful of poorly trained pilots aboard. They sailed to Leyte to die uselessly as decoys. That was the shape of the victory Spruance had actually won. It just did not look like the victory anyone had expected. Years later, after Japan had surrendered and the war was over, American interrogators sat down with Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa in Tokyo. They asked him a question that went to the heart of everything that had happened in the Philippine Sea. They asked him what had made the American fast carrier force so difficult to fight. What had been the decisive factor? What was it about the American task force that his fleet could not overcome? Ozawa did not answer with numbers. He did not talk about the 15 American aircraft carriers. He did not talk about the 475 Hellcats or the industrial production rates that had built them. He did not talk about the Marines who had taken Saipan or the B-29s that had burned Tokyo from those airfields. He did not talk about any of the things that showed up in the post-war statistics. He talked about radar. He talked about the interception of radio communications. He talked about the American ability to detect incoming Japanese airstrikes at long range and to direct fighters into their path before the attackers could reach the fleet. He had built his plan around range and timing and discipline. He had discovered on the afternoon of June 19, 1944, that the Americans had built a system of range and timing and communication that was simply better. Not because it was bigger, though it was bigger. Not because it had more of everything, though it did. Better integrated, better informed, better able to convert raw information into directed violence before the attacker could adapt. That was the answer. That was what Ozawa had understood by the time the war was over. The number 423 was the number of aircraft his carriers had held at dawn. The number 315 was the number that had not come back. But the number that mattered was invisible. It was the number of American men in dimly lit, windowless rooms, staring at plotting boards, speaking into radio microphones, listening to Japanese radio checks, doing arithmetic in their heads, and turning the position of a Japanese aircraft on a two-dimensional plot into a corpse in the water. You could not count that number. You could not photograph it. You could not put it on a recruiting poster. But it was what won the battle. It was what killed the Imperial Japanese Navy's carrier aviation. It was what Ozawa, standing on the bridge of Taiho on the morning of June 19th, could not see and did not understand and did not know existed. By the time he understood, hundreds of his men were dead. His flagship was at the bottom of the Philippine Sea, and the sword of the Imperial Navy had been broken in his hands. He lived until 1966. 4 months after the Philippine Sea, he would put to sea one more time, commanding the Japanese Northern Force at the Battle of Leyte Gulf, and would watch the last of his carriers go down at Cape Engano, fulfilling their role as bait. He gave interviews after the war. He wrote reflections. He was, by all accounts of the men who met him after the war, a quiet and thoughtful man who had come to understand what had happened to him. The distance he had trusted had not protected him. The discipline he had valued had not hidden him. The pillars he had built his plan around had not held. The system he had never seen had killed him anyway.